In early March 1945, a column of the American Phantom Division reached the heights above the small Rhine town of Hansbrook. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Ellery raised his binoculars and for a second forgot to breathe. Spanning the gray-blue ribbon of the Rhinefluss stood the steel-arched Königsbruck Bridge intact. By every enemy instruction, all crossings should already have been reduced to charred piles of metal. Lieutenant Mark Stein, the son of German immigrants, voiced what everyone felt. Either we take it now, or it won't be there at all. No one yet understood that holding this strip of stone and metal would collapse the enemy's entire cool geometry of defense. The Rhinefluss wasn't just a river. It was a natural moat, 300 meters wide, with treacherous current and steep banks, a western bastion for centuries. In those days, the regime hoped to hide behind the water, win weeks, reshuffle bloodless units, and bargain for a special peace. One intact bridge turned hope into a hole in the dam. Another irony: Königsbruck had been built in the previous war by interned laborers. Its stone towers with embrasures and massive trusses were made so strong that even engineers didn't believe in half measures. Either it was whole or it lay in the river. For a long time, the enemy had kept standard demolition chambers, but after earlier untimely blasts, some systems were removed. New orders tied the demolition procedure into a knot of bureaucracy and fear. Blow it too soon, face a court-martial. Blow it too late, face a firing squad. That hoarse whisper ran through their staffs all winter. And there before Ellery and Stein lay a bridge, still carrying figures and rumbling trucks, with dark boxes of charges bolted to the trusses. Time shrank to one decision: advance before it's too late. By February, the enemy's Ardennes offensive had sputtered out into a black vortex of losses. The mobile fist, touted by radio bulletins, dissolved into snow and gasoline. Between Kölnberg and Kobelstadt, the foe held only scattered battalions, many teenage militia, and exhausted batteries. Sector command for Hansbrook belonged to the 15th Army, but its roster of combat-ready rifles barely reached a third of what was needed. On top of the chaos came a leadership calamity. Corps Commander General Erich Falken had been ambushed and captured the day before. His replacement, Rudolf von Osten, couldn't reach the town. American patrols had cut the roads. Overnight, responsibility for Königsbruck's defense fell onto General Otto Stahls, 60-plus kilometers away, who had seen the bridge only on a schematic. He sent forward his adjutant, Major Hans Strahl, with 8 men and a radio, counting on sweep-up, scooping up stragglers along the road to patch a screen. The radio was lost, fuel ran out, and Strahl reached the bridge near noon, just a couple of hours before the Americans appeared on the ridges. The man actually in charge on the spot was Captain Willy Brenner, the bridge commandant. His books showed 600 rifles. In reality, 36 emaciated infantrymen, a few AA gunners, and a sapper platoon half composed of former POWs from Eastern battalions. The charges lay not on the trusses, but in a depot by the East Tunnel portal. The order to install them arrived late, and 2 engineer officers spent the night hauling 2.8 tons of explosives under whistling shellfire. By morning, the system was half-mounted and depended on a single cable laid along a beam, exposed like a nerve beneath the skin. The town of Hansbrook had long lost its spa smile. Half its blocks lay under bombing dust. Lieutenant Colonel Ellery's combat groups from the 14th Tank Battalion and 27th Armored Infantry Battalion reached the western outskirts when the clouds parted by chance, as if the weather itself signed the recon report. Brigade General Robert Hale, the task force commander, climbed the embankment beside Ellery. He saw what all saw: a living ribbon of traffic on the bridge, crowds of refugees at the approaches, and black boxes of charges on the trusses. The day's plan had called for a turn south to link with the Third Army. Reality flipped the map. We take it now. Hale's words sliced off. Any hesitation delays would cost a blast. On the east bank, Major Strahl finally reached the tunnel mouth beneath the Eberstein Ridge. Captain Brenner briefed fast. Electric circuit assembled, reserve fuse, but the defensive perimeter was fiction. Most of the troops he'd hoped to intercept had already crossed or veered south. Lieutenant Karl Peterson's AA battery on the west bank begged for a few more minutes to withdraw. They had a new rocket apparatus and feared abandoning secrets. Strahl wavered. In the west, American Pershings rolled into town and smashed the first strongpoints, screening the infantry with smoke. The decision bowed not to doctrine, but to nerves. We wait 1 minute until the AA passes. That minute would stretch into fate. The first line in town fell fast. The streets were empty, firing points few and poorly linked. Enemy sappers, following instructions, blew the western approach around 1520. Gouging of vast crater tanks wouldn't pass, but infantry would. Lieutenant Mark Stein's companies dashed along the Königsbruck roadway, sheltering in the shadows of towers and railings. Machine guns spat from the eastern portal and embrasures. AA guns depressed to fire at ground targets. Rounds rang on the trusses like hail on a roof. On the east bank, Engineer Captain Karl kept his hand on the detonator key. When Peterson's battery finally rattled through, Major Strahl gave the order, blow. Friesen turned the key. Nothing. Somewhere a wire had been cut or a contact ripped loose. No one would ever know. Stein's men were already 2/3 across. American engineers, among them Sergeant Eugene Dorland, snipped every nerve they could reach. Then enemy sapper Lance Corporal Anton Faust burst from cover, sprinted 100 meters under fire, and lit the backup fuse. The reserve blast slammed bodies to deck. The bridge rocked and settled, the deck sagged by a handspan, but the arches held. In that instant, Sergeant Alex Drabik surged onto the east bank. For the first time in decades, armed Americans reached the far side of the Rhinefluss by bridge rather than by boats. After the failed electric blast, panic rippled through the tunnel, but trained people move on muscle memory. Enemy engineers scrambled to find spare caps and lash new circuits. At the same time, Stein's companies widened the foothold, carving into the Eberstein slope, seizing the ruins of guardhouses and the tunnel mouth. By 1700, the west portal was in American hands. Hundreds of prisoners crammed the tunnel, some audibly relieved. Major Strahl, realizing the point of no return had passed, made a choice that would save some and doom himself. He mounted a bicycle and rode east to find Corps HQ and report in person. 4 days later he would be seized, condemned by a flying court, and shot his name added to the long ledger of scapegoats. On the American side, the report chain snapped taut like a telegraph line. General Hale told Division Commander Paul Redford, "The bridge is ours." Redford reached 1st Army HQ, where Charles Hayward literally knocked over his cup grabbing the phone. Minutes later, he was on with Army Group Commander Owen Barrett. Hearing the news, Barrett leaned back and barked a hoarse laugh. "Well now, Charles, drive it while it holds." Then came the call to the Supreme Commander Arthur Eisen, who immediately flipped priorities. Everything spared to Hainzbrook. News of the crossing hit enemy HQs like cold water. The Berlin regime still dreamed of a miraculous delay. The river would stall the Westerners while a fist formed in the east. An intact bridge in March shattered this self-soothing. Instead of understanding why the system failed, the top chose the usual medicine fear. Into the Führer's headquarters strode Colonel General Rudolf Hubert, notorious for his flying courts in the east. He was handed the right to dispense field justice without codes or counsel. That same day, Field Marshal Gerd von Runow was sacked. Someone big had to be blamed. He was replaced by the firefighter Field Marshal Albert Kessler, who, even studying the map, admitted holding the line was now almost impossible. In the following days, Hubert's flying court swept through staffs like a scythe. 4 officers tied to the demolition were condemned. Major Strahl, Lieutenant Karl for losing secret equipment, and 2 engineer majors who had wired the charges days earlier. Sentence shot in the woods near Rimwald. Captain Willy Brenner was condemned in absentia, already a prisoner. Engineer Karl Friesen, the man who had actually turned the key, was acquitted in absentia, a rare stab of logic in the Black March days. Orders about the executions went to every unit. Know what awaits a misstep. In truth, the terror only cemented despair. Where flexibility and initiative are needed, fear kills both. Meanwhile, the bridge lived. It shuddered under non-stop traffic. Infantry, engineers, batteries, then tanks and tractors. American MPs directed the flow. Floodlights lit the deck at night. Engineer battalions laid temporary crossings in parallel. First, a light treadway north of the span, then pontoons to the south. Command followed one principle: make the bridgehead irreversible. Even if the old span finally gave up, the enemy hurled at Hainzbrook everything that could still fly or crawl. Arado and Messerschmitt jets attacked at furious speed, almost impossible to intercept, but their accuracy was worse than their pilots wished. On the banks, a box of AA batteries rose 5 battalions, hundreds of barrels, tracer lines raking the sky. By night, the river carried logs packed with H. Below, combat swimmers tried to slip through their outlines, were ripped from the dark by canal defense lights, secret beams sweeping the surface. They even dragged up the super-heavy mortar, Kalgarit. A few shells thudded in uselessly. All this cost blood and metal, but not the main objective, the demolition of the crossings. Every failure became a morale shot for the Americans, and a stab of despair for the foe. 10 days later, when worn rivets began to tick and the arch to groan softly, the old Königsbruck would fold into the water, taking with it 24 engineers who had tightened bolts to the last. But by then, the parallel bridges had taken the load, and the east bank flow only increased. By the end of the 3rd week, after seizing the Rheinfluss crossing, more than 100,000 American soldiers stood on the east bank. The bridgehead spread dozens of kilometers in width and depth, absorbing a slice of Autobahn toward Frankfeld. As soon as it grew cramped, armored groups burst into raids. Combat Command B covered over 100 kilometers in a day. Enemy resistance broke into patches. Entire units surrendered, seeing the futility of counterattacks. For Field Marshal Walter Muller's HQ, holding the front farther north, the picture became an unsolvable equation. Simultaneously, strangle the Hainzbrook salient, brace for other Allied crossings, and prevent encirclement of the industrial Ruhrkrug, the heart of coal and steel. One regiment can't solve 3 missions. Losing Ruhrkrug meant the end not just of the front, but of factories, fuel, and ammunition. From that moment, the question wasn't months of war, but weeks. Even allies who had planned massive set-piece crossings farther north adjusted their tempo. Why wait for ceremony if we're already inside? The river line ceased to be a line. It became a starting gun. How much time did one intact bridge save? Estimates varied from several weeks to a couple of months. Engineer Colonel Frank Lyons, whose battalions first defused and secured the spans, named tens of thousands of lives spared the assault boats and heavy preparatory fires elsewhere weren't needed. Historians like Ken Hecker later wrote, "The capture of Königsbruck materially hastened the end, but the arithmetic isn't linear." More important was that the foe's strategy of lingering behind the river and reweaving the front collapsed. Psychology charged its tax. On the American side, the news of an intact crossing ran through Congress applause, a surge in bond sales, an acute sense that the finish is near. On the German side, faith in the regime's competence cracked. For months they'd been told the Rhine was impregnable, yet a hole appeared almost casually, from fear, orders, and grim irony. The flying executions only underscored that the system beat its own for failures it had itself engineered. And every tragedy still has names. Major Strahl, a 1-year-old, career officer who could not stop a division with one platoon and one key. Lieutenant Peterson, a tech man trying to save secrets. Two engineer majors who ran cable day and night. They were shot in wet March to set an example. Years later, Hubert, the judge executioner, would serve time for the illegal killings. Late justice would not resurrect those felled in the woods, but would record that even in chaos, law still has a word. The end of this story isn't only iron and orders. It's about people sprinting across a deck knowing hell might ignite beneath them. About Lieutenant Mark Stein, leading a company through crossfire. About Sergeant Alex Drabik, bursting first onto the East Bank. About sappers like Eugene Dorland, cutting explosive nerves under machine gun whistle. About tankers screening the infantry with smoke and HE. About staff officers who recognized a chance and slammed an entire corps through it. The bridge over the Rheinfluss at Heinsbruck lived 10 terrible great days and collapsed when its task was done. The stone towers on both banks survived. The western ones became the Königsbruck Peace Museum. The eastern, an auditorium where a violin's timbre replaced the echo of machine guns. At the 80th anniversary ceremony, speeches on both sides carried a simple meaning. Sometimes, history pivots on a scatter of coincidences. The fog lifts at the right time. A wire is cut at the right second. Someone is late. Someone is on time. But decisive, always, is the choice of people in a specific moment. Had the assault been delayed, the story would have run longer and bloodier. Had the electric circuit fired, we would be reading different memoirs. One way or another, that march was when a river turned from a wall into a road. And the sooner that happened, the more lives, military and civilian, the war's last weeks failed to claim.